Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Brad Musil, and this is a reading of Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James. This will be part 4 of chapter 2, Friedrich Nietzsche and the Antichrist. Again, this is part 4, Religion and Health. In a sense, Nietzsche's master-slave distinction can be reduced to a difference in one's psychological attitude toward or outlook on life. In his view, the way that individuals deal with the reality of their existence and any concomitant existential anxieties reflects a great deal about them. And whether they are masters or slaves essentially comes down to whether they can be truthful with themselves about this reality. The crucial factor is whether, when faced with the existential anxieties associated with life as a human being, they, 1, accept their natural existence for what it is, including all the pain and suffering within it, and its lack of an objective standard or ultimate purpose, in which case they are considered masters, or 2, resent or bemoan it and render it something it is not, thus deceiving themselves with illusions, which he also calls ideals and idols, for the sake of comfort, in which case they are considered slaves. As Nietzsche is fond of putting the point, masters are those who say yes to life, while slaves are those who say no to it. For Nietzsche, the slave's preoccupation with comfort and his or her condemnation of the suffering inherent in earthly life amounts to resenting this life. Indeed, as I've shown in part 2 and part 3, Nietzsche thinks that slaves spend much of their energy dwelling on the pain and suffering in their earthly life, often, especially in the case of religious individuals, anticipating a better existence in another life hereafter. According to Nietzsche, slaves are troubled by the nature of life itself, and this leads them to live restricted and self-sacrificing lives in the service of the disillusioned ideals that they have invented for the sake of coping with the pain and suffering they obsess about. All of this goes to show that Nietzsche's analysis of master and slave mentalities stems from what was, for him, a much more critical concern, the problem of nihilism. Moreover, the sickness and mental disease that Nietzsche associates with religion and other instances of the slave mentality also reflect this problem. For Nietzsche, nihilism essentially entails saying no to life. It is a kind of negation and depreciation of earthly life. In turn, much of his philosophy aims to combat nihilism, which is why Kaufmann claims that, quote, to escape nihilism, which seems involved both in asserting the existence of God and thus robbing this world of ultimate significance, and also in denying God and thus robbing everything of meaning and value, that is Nietzsche's greatest and most persistent problem, end quote. Footnote 299 cites the source. As Kaufmann intimates here, Nietzsche often talks about nihilism in a manner that suggests it comes in stages and can be classified into different types. And we shall see shortly that, while Nietzsche derides religion for being nihilistic, he's even more worried about more extreme, non-religious cases of nihilism. He characterizes nihilism and the plight of the religious as if there is a natural progression involved, warning his readers that religious individuals typically constitute milder versions of nihilism, and that they can evolve into much worse kinds. Ultimately, what is most troubling and problematic about the slave mentality is the anti-life sentiment that underlies it, which renders it nihilistic. He argues that, as a result of the slave mentality, morality is, quote, not the expression of the conditions of a people's life and growth anymore, not its most basic instinct of life anymore, but instead something abstract, an opponent of life, end quote. Footnote 300 cites the source. In a similar vein, he writes, quote, I consider life itself to be an instinct for growth, for endurance, for the accumulation of force, for power. When there is no will to power, there is decline. My claim is that none of humanity's highest values have had this will, that nihilistic values, values of decline, have taken control under the aegis of holiest names. End quote. Footnote 301 cites the source. Similarly, he claims that church concepts are, quote, the most malicious counterfeits that exist to devalue nature and natural values, end quote. Footnote 302 cites the source. He maintains that when religions like Christianity take hold over the masses, the highest values central to healthy and flourishing character, i.e. things that masters value, like life affirmation, personal expression, truthfulness, etc., are flipped on their head and instead life negation is praised. Thus, in the case of Christianity, Nietzsche suggests that, quote, the instinct of resentment and said no to everything on earth that represented the ascending movement of life, success, power, beauty, self-affirmation, but it could do this only by becoming ingenious and inventing another world, a world that viewed affirmation of life as evil, as intrinsically reprehensible, end quote. Footnote 303 cites the source. From the slave's perspective, life on earth is best depicted as an obstacle to be overcome and as devoid of any significant value. Contrary to Nietzsche and those like him who aim to affirm earthly life, the slave values or fails to view this life as valuable in itself. In the worst case scenarios, an emphasis on pain and suffering causes slaves to renounce their earthly lives altogether, much as Schopenhauer does, and sometimes even to commit suicide. It is fair to say that Nietzsche despises this kind of anti-naturalism and its denigration of earthly existence more than anything else. Nietzsche believes that this nihilistic impulse is a trademark of all instances of the slave mentality, including religious and non-religious instances. I think it is important to note that anyone can be a slave, i.e., nihilistic, and indeed, slaves come from all walks of life. To be sure, homeless individuals can be masters, and CEOs can be slaves. In the case of slaves, the bottom line is that they negate life in some manner regardless of their particular circumstances. As I mentioned in the introduction to this chapter, Nietzsche was heavily influenced by Schopenhauer, an atheist who was highly critical of most of the philosophy preceding him, just as Nietzsche's own philosophy would later turn out to be. Although Nietzsche often gives Schopenhauer high praise, his own philosophy in many ways aims to refute the pessimism manifest in much of Schopenhauer's thought, which ultimately renders Schopenhauer a slave. Briefly, Schopenhauer suggested that because our desires can never be completely satisfied and we are, therefore, forever destined to a life of discontent, it is essentially futile to seek satisfaction and joy in the first place. Wicks, who is also the author of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on Schopenhauer, elaborates on the desolate prospects of Schopenhauer's pessimistic worldview, suggesting that, for Schopenhauer, quote, the world is represented as being in a condition of eternal frustration, as it endlessly strives for nothing in particular, and as it goes essentially nowhere, end quote. Footnote 3 or 4 cites the source, and, quote, the world of daily life is essentially violent and frustrating, end quote. Footnote 305 cites the source. On Schopenhauer's account, we are better off investing as little energy in life as possible, trying to desire as little as possible, in which case the pain and suffering that inevitably accompany it will not sting quite as much. In a sense, the less we get our hopes up to begin with, the less we come to expect of our lives, the less we will feel let down in the long run. Our best course of action is to try and soften the blow, so to speak. Consequently, as Wicks suggests, quote, the result is an attitude of the denial towards our will to live, which Schopenhauer identifies with an ascetic attitude of renunciation, resignation, and willlessness, end quote. Footnote 306 cites the source. Schopenhauer presents us with a more extreme case of nihilism than does the typical religious person, since earthly life seems entirely meaningless for him, whereas earthly life retains a kind of integral value for the religious person, insofar as it is thought to determine one's eternal destiny. Interestingly, it is the non-religious instances of nihilism, such as the case of Schopenhauer, that Nietzsche fears the most. In part 5, I will discuss how Nietzsche's notion that God is dead captures this concern, but first I want to elaborate on the problematic nature of nihilism and why Nietzsche deems religion nihilistic. While intellectual honesty and pursuit of the truth are among Nietzsche's highest values, and religion is, in his view, objectionable insofar as it fails to uphold them, it is health that he values above all else. Accordingly, Wicks points out that in Nietzsche's Untimely Meditations, quote, Nietzsche claims that the principle of life is more pressing and higher concern than that of knowledge, and that the quest for knowledge should serve the interests of life, end quote. Footnote 307 cites the source. Likewise, Wicks points out that, quote, this parallels how, in The Birth of Tragedy, Nietzsche looked at art through the perspective of life, end quote. Footnote 308 cites the source. As we've seen, honesty in the pursuit of truth certainly matters to Nietzsche, but living a healthy life ultimately matters much more. Not surprisingly, then, what makes nihilism, and therefore religion, particularly problematic for Nietzsche is that it is unhealthy and unnatural. Indeed, he thinks that nihilism is a sign of a psychologically diseased organism that cannot handle the reality of life. Nietzsche argues that, instead of helping people survive and flourish, religion and other instances of the slave mentality spread decadence. Indeed, Nietzsche explicitly associates religion, especially Christianity, with weakness and mental illness throughout the Antichrist. In section 5, for example, he suggests that, quote, Christianity has taken the side of everything weak, base, failed. It has made an ideal out of whatever contradicts the preservation instincts of a strong life, end quote. Footnote 309 cites the source. Later, in section 22, he writes, quote, Christianity wants to rule over beasts of prey. Its method is to make them sick. Weakening is the Christian recipe for domestication, for civilization, end quote. Footnote 310 cites the source. And in section 52, quote, sickness belongs to the essence of Christianity. The typical Christian state of faith has to be a form of sickness. Whatever makes things sick is good. Whatever comes from fullness, from overfullness, from power is evil. This is how the faithful see things. End quote. Footnote 311 cites the source. Ultimately, Nietzsche believes that quote, Christianity is based on the rancor of the sick, the instinct against the healthy, against health. End quote. Footnote 312 cites the source. In view of these considerations, and of the popularity of Christianity and other instantiations of the slave mentality, he ultimately laments that, quote, comparatively speaking, humans are the biggest failures, the sickliest animals who have strayed the most dangerously far from their instincts, end quote. Footnote 313 cites the source. Once again, further complicating matters is the fact that slaves do not recognize their own weakness and disease. Hence, quote, they do not call themselves weak, they call themselves the good, end quote. Footnote 314 cites the source. Likewise, a priest, quote, will instinctively deny that sickness is sickness, end quote. Footnote 315 cites the source. Nietzsche offers several specific examples of how religion is unhealthy. For instance, in his estimation, traditional conceptions of morality, which most religions inculcate in their teachings and doctrines, are unhealthy. This is why, when reflecting on Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morality, Wicks suggests that, quote, Nietzsche offers a competing account of the origin of moral values, aiming to reveal their life-negating foundations and functions, end quote. Footnote 316 cites the source. Recall that traditional conceptions of morality require us to set aside our own interests for the sake of attending to the interests of others. For example, utilitarians present arguments in favor of sacrificing oneself if doing so is for the greater good. This kind of self-sacrifice is, in Nietzsche's view, unnatural and unhealthy, and it is arguably non-existent in the natural order of the world outside of humanity. In this vein, he writes, quote, I call an animal, a species, an individual corrupt when it loses its instincts, when it chooses, when it prefers things that will harm it, end quote. Footnote 317 cites the source. To be sure, this self-sacrifice afflicts many instantiations of the slave mentality, including the religious. After all, there are ample biblical verses imploring believers to live for the Lord, or for others and not for oneself. For example, Jesus says that, quote, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me, end quote. Footnote 318 cites the source. And, quote, greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends, end quote. Footnote 319 cites the source. Moreover, while those proclaiming their religious faith are often praised and admired, Nietzsche believes that, in reality, they are weak and not worthy of admiration at all. He puts the point as follows, quote, men of faith, the faithful of every type, necessarily dependent people, the sort of people who cannot posit themselves as a goal. The man of faith does not belong to himself. He can only be a means. He needs to be used up, end quote. Footnote 320 cites the source. Likewise, he suggests that, quote, the need for faith, for some unconditional yes or no, is a need of the weak, end quote. Footnote 321 cites the source. He alleges that the person of faith is diseased insofar as faith entails submission to a higher power, and in the process through relinquishing of one's own natural will to power. Accordingly, Nietzsche writes, quote, every type of faith is an expression of self-abnegation, of self-alienation. Just think how the vast majority of people need some regulative guideline as an external principle of bondage or mooring, how compulsion, slavery in a higher sense, is the only and ultimate condition for the thriving of the weak-willed person, end quote. Footnote 322 cites the source. Not surprisingly, Nietzsche suggests that he and other free spirits, i.e. masters, are skeptics and abhor faith. Thus he writes, quote, make no mistake about it, great spirits are skeptics. Zarathustra is a skeptic. The vigor, the freedom that comes from the strength and super strength of spirit proves itself through skepticism, end quote. Footnote 323 cites the source. Further, given Nietzsche's naturalism, it should come as no surprise that he also views the supernatural concepts commonly associated with religion, for example, souls and immortality, as unhealthy too. He emphasizes that religion entails an unhealthy negation of natural earthly life by way of such supernatural emphases, suggesting, for instance, that, quote, pure spirit is a pure stupidity. When we discount the nervous system and the senses, the mortal shroud, we miscount, nothing more, end quote. Footnote 324 cites the source, and that, quote, the enormous lie of personal immortality destroys all reason, everything natural in the instincts, everything beneficial and life-enhancing in the instincts, everything that guarantees the future now arouses mistrust, end quote. Footnote 325 cites the source. For Nietzsche, religion, and other instances of the slave mentality, teaches people, quote, to become perfect by acting like turtles and pulling their senses inside themselves, cutting off contact with worldly things, and shedding their mortal shrouds, end quote. Footnote 326 cites the source. Hence, a distinction arises between worldly dispositions, excuse me, i.e. those that affirm earthly life, and otherworldly dispositions, i.e. those that negate earthly life by emphasizing supernatural phenomena. Instead of affirming earthly life and accentuating worldly concerns, Nietzsche suggests that religions cater to otherworldly emphases. Accordingly, for many religious individuals, the value of worldly life is thought to be diminished, insofar as earthly life is reduced to being a trial that dictates our fates in a more important future existence. For such individuals, earthly life becomes merely a test to see who is worthy of a place in heaven, rather than a prize to be enjoyed and naturally valued in itself. Thus, Nietzsche stresses that what really matters for many religious individuals is not what transpires, what they achieve or become during their life on earth, but whether they are granted access into heaven afterward. Nietzsche, of course, objects to this, lamenting that, quote, when the emphasis of life is put on the beyond rather than on life itself, when it is put on nothingness, then the emphasis has been completely removed from life, end quote. Footnote 327 cites the source. When someone dies, it is not uncommon for religious individuals to comfort the deceased's loved ones by saying things like, quote, that they've moved on to a better place, end quote. But for Nietzsche, whose naturalism admits of no such place, this kind of suggestion simply amounts to an unhealthy denial of reality. Due to otherworldly dispositions, time, energy, and resources are taken away from life-affirming activities, which Nietzsche clearly believes is unnatural and unhealthy. In sum, religion is unhealthy because its otherworldly nature is thought to undermine our prospects for a flourishing earthly existence. Interestingly, in the following, Richard Dawkins, who is associated with the New Atheism movement, articulates a position akin to Nietzsche's. Quote, as a Darwinian, the aspect of religion that catches my attention is its profligate wastefulness, its extravagant display of baroque uselessness. Nature is a miserly accountant, grudging the pennies, watching the clock, punishing the smallest waste. If a wild animal habitually performs some useless activity, natural selection will favor rival individuals who instead devote time to surviving and reproducing. Nature cannot afford frivolous jeux d'esprit. Ruthless utilitarianism trumps, even if it doesn't always seem that way. Religious behavior in bipedal apes occupies large quantities of time. It devours huge resources. A medieval cathedral consumed hundreds of man-centuries in its building. Sacred music and devotional paintings largely monopolized medieval and Renaissance talent. End quote. Footnote 328 cites the source. Similarly, Nietzsche's problem with Christianity's God and comparable gods of other religions is that God becomes, quote, the formula for every slander against the here and now, for every lie about the beyond. God as the deification of nothingness, the canonization of the will to nothingness, end quote. Footnote 329 cites the source. In Nietzsche's view, this idea of God signals another way in which religion denatures reality, and it therefore provides further proof that religion is unhealthy. God ultimately becomes, quote, a contradiction of life, instead of its transfiguration and eternal yes, end quote. Footnote 330 cites the source. Nietzsche suggests that there is nothing about the Christian God that is worth worshipping, and he even goes so far as to deem such a God, quote, a crime against life, end quote. Speaking to other free spirits, i.e. masters like himself, he writes, quote, we are separated by the fact that we view the thing worshipped as God as pathetic, absurd, and harmful, not as divine, and end quote, and quote, we do not treat it as a simple error, but as a crime against life, end quote. Footnote 331 cites the source. Ultimately, Nietzsche believes that such a God is needed and advocated by weak individuals who cannot handle reality as it actually is. Accordingly, in section 17 of the Antichrist, he writes, quote, whenever the will to power falls off in any way, there will also be physiological decline, decadence. And when the most masculine virtues and drives have been chopped off, the god of decadence, he will necessarily turn into a god of the physiologically retrograde, the weak, end quote. Footnote 332 cites the source. In a similar vein, Nietzsche talks at length about the demerits of pity, a feeling that is often encouraged by most slaves, including the religious, in many of his works. In fact, he suggests that, quote, pity is the practice of nihilism, end quote. Footnote 333 cites the source, and that, quote, In the middle of our unhealthy modernity, nothing is less healthy than Christian pity, end quote. Footnote 334 cites the source. For Nietzsche, the problem with pity is that it involves dwelling on pain and suffering. Instead of accepting pain and suffering as they come and then forgetting about them, those expressing pity remain focused on these conditions. Thus, Nietzsche writes, quote, pity has a depressive effect. It further intensifies and multiplies the loss of strength, which in itself brings suffering to life, end quote. Footnote 335 cites the source. Similarly, he suggests that, quote, by multiplying misery just as much as by conserving everything miserable, pity is one of the main tools used to increase decadence. Pity wins people over to nothingness, end quote. Footnote 336 cites the source. According to Nietzsche, those expressing pity call attention to pain and suffering when they should be moving on to life's next challenge. Hence, quote, pity preserves things that are ripe for decline. It defends things that have been disowned and condemned by life. And it gives a depressive and questionable character to life itself by keeping alive an abundance of failures of every type. End quote. Footnote 337 cites the source. Alternatively, he praises Aristotle for recognizing the dangers associated with pity, saying, quote, Aristotle famously saw pity as a dangerous pathology that should be purged from the system every once in a while. End quote. Footnote 338 cites the source. Most would agree that fear and guilt, when not employed as a necessary means for some perceived good, are unwanted, as these feelings only engender psychological discomfort for those who experience them. To be sure, there are certainly instances when fear and guilt are warranted. For example, we are better off if we learn to fear crocodiles, and most would agree that we ought to reproach ourselves for physically assaulting someone for no reason. However, on Nietzsche's account, religions often elicit and propagate unnecessary fear and guilt, which ultimately proves to be unhealthy. Wicks points this out when reflecting on the genealogy of morals, writing that, quote, Nietzsche continues with an account of how feelings of guilt or the bad conscience arise merely as a consequence of an unhealthy Christian morality that turns an evil eye towards our natural inclinations. End quote. Footnote 339 cites the source. The suggestion here is that supernatural religions, like Christianity and Islam, exert so much control over some individuals that these individuals are riddled with unnecessary guilt regarding some of their most natural feelings and thoughts. Footnote 340. As we will see in Chapter 3, James offers many relevant examples in his survey of religious cases comprising the varieties of religious experience. End of footnote 340. Along these lines, Nietzsche claims that the contempt of sexuality or sexual prudishness is anti-natural, and that as a result, quote, the preacher of chastity is a public incitement to anti-nature, end quote. Footnote 341 cites the source. Moreover, the emphasis on reward and punishment in a life hereafter, a prominent feature of many religions, naturally solicits fear over one's eternal prospects. On Nietzsche's account, this fear turns out to be unnecessary, since such supernatural belief is illusory. Nietzsche also argues that Christianity is depressive and that it engenders misery. Quote, it is Christian, he writes, to hate the senses, to hate enjoyment of the senses, to hate joy in general, end quote. And for the Christian, he thinks, quote, dismal and upsetting thoughts have pride of place, end quote. Footnote 342 cites the source. Interestingly, Nietzsche speaks at great length about Buddhism, another world religion, when depicting Christianity in this manner, juxtaposing these two major religions in terms of the general dispositions he thinks they facilitate. In contrast with Christianity, Nietzsche thinks that Buddhism exudes cheerfulness and realizes its goal of minimizing conscious suffering. To be clear, Nietzsche still believes that Buddhism is slavish and nihilistic, as it encourages us to minimize our natural desires and thus does not embrace earthly life to the fullest extent possible. On this point, he says, quote, I do not want my condemnation of Christianity to lead me to be unfair to a related religion, Buddhism. The two belong together as nihilistic religions. End quote. Footnote 343 cites the source. Nevertheless, while Buddhism is still slavish to a degree, it avoids the pervasive feelings of dread and misery that Nietzsche thinks accompany other supernatural religions like Christianity. And as a result, Nietzsche is careful to clearly demarcate Buddhism from Christianity, suggesting that, quote, there are the most striking differences between them, end quote. Footnote 344 cites the source, and that, quote, Buddhism is 100 times more realistic than Christianity, end quote. Footnote 345 cites the source. In fact, Nietzsche believes that Buddhism is one of a kind when it comes to religions, claiming that Buddhism is the only, quote, Buddhism is the only really positivistic religion in history, end quote. Footnote 346 cites the source. He reaches this conclusion because he thinks that Buddhism, quote, has stopped saying war against sin and instead, giving reality its due, says war against suffering, end quote. Footnote 347 cites the source. And because, quote, in sharp contrast to Christianity, it has left the self-deception of moral concepts behind, it stands, as I put it, beyond good and evil, end quote. Footnote 348 cites the source. Similarly, he suggests that, quote, Buddhism is 100 times colder, truer, more objective. It no longer needs to make its suffering, its susceptibility to pain, respectable by interpreting it as a sin, end quote. Footnote 349 cites the source. Likewise, when expounding on what he calls the three Christian virtues, faith, love, and hope, he says, quote, I call them the three Christian shrewdnesses, end quote. Footnote 350 cites the source. And he specifically mentions that, quote, Buddhism is too mature, too positivist to be shrewd like this, end quote. Footnote 351 cites the source. According to Nietzsche, whereas Christianity engenders misery and depression, the Buddha, quote, insists on ideas that produce either calm or amusement, end quote. Footnote 352 cites the source. This is explained in turn by the further fact that Buddhism is, quote, based on two physiological facts that it always keeps in mind. First, an excessively acute sensitivity that is expressed as a refined susceptibility to pain, and second, having lived all too long with concepts and logical procedures and over-spiritualization that has had the effect of promoting the impersonal instincts at the expense of the personal ones. These physiological conditions, which Nietzsche believes afflict Christianity and other religions but not Buddhism, give rise to depression, end quote. Footnote 353 cites the source. In other words, Nietzsche asserts that Buddhism appreciates the problems associated with the self-sacrificing nature of other slavish religions. Thus, he suggests that, quote, the Buddha detects a spiritual fatigue that manifests itself in an all too great objectivity, which is to say, an individual's diminished sense of self-interest, loss of center of gravity, loss of egoism. He combats this by leading even the most spiritual interest directly back to the person, end quote. Footnote 354 cites the source. In contrast to Christianity and other popular religions, quote, the highest goals of Buddhism are cheerfulness, quiet, and absence of desire, and these goals are achieved, end quote. Footnote 355 cites the source. Recall that Nietzsche thinks that the priestly caste is much to blame for falsifications he associates with religion, as discussed in Part 3. Nietzsche also believes that priests are largely responsible for the unhealthy aspects of religion, including, for example, many of the difficulties he associates with common conceptions of God. Accordingly, he suggests that, quote, the reality behind this pitiful lie, i.e., the idea of a moral world order, is a parasitical type of person who thrives at the expense of all healthy developments of life. The priest abuses the name of God. He gives the name kingdom of God to a state of affairs where the priests determine the value of things, end quote. Footnote 356 cites the source. When this happens, quote, the parasitism of the priest, of the moral world order, takes every natural custom, every natural institution, state, judicial order, marriage, care for the sick and the poor, everything required by the instinct of life, in short, everything intrinsically valuable, and renders it fundamentally worthless, of negative value, end quote. Footnote 357 cites the source. He argues that from this priestly perspective, people, quote, should suffer so that they are always in need of a priest, end quote. Footnote 358 cites the source. In a similar fashion, he claims that the church, quote, lived on distress. It created distress in order to eternalize itself. Footnote 350, end quote. Footnote 359 cites the source. Consequently, he remarks, quote, parasitism as the church's only practice, drinking all the blood, all the love, all the hope out of life, with its ideals of enmia and sanctity. The beyond is the will to negate every reality against life itself, end quote. Footnote 360 cites the source. He echoes these sentiments throughout the Antichrist, writing, for instance, that, quote, for the type of person who wields power inside Judaism and Christianity, a priestly type, decadence is only a means. This type of person has a life interest in making humanity sick and twisting the concepts good and evil, true and false, to the point where they endanger life and slander the world, end quote. Footnote 361 cites the source. Elsewhere, he reflects that, quote, wherever the influence of theologians is felt, value judgments are turned on their heads and the concepts of true and false are necessarily inverted. Whatever hurts life the most is called true, and whatever improves, increases, affirms, justifies life, or makes it triumph is called false, end quote. Footnote 362 cites the source. What's more, he believes that the problems stemming from priests are exacerbated by the fact that priests are usually viewed as praiseworthy and exemplary individuals. This causes them to become popular and viewed as necessary figures in society, thanks to which their influence becomes even more pronounced. Conversely, since Nietzsche himself thinks that, quote, every type of anti-nature is a vice, end quote, footnote 363 cites the source, he concludes in the final section of the Antichrist that, quote, the priest is the most vicious type of person. He teaches anti-nature. Priests are not to be reasoned with. They are to be locked up, end quote, footnote 364 cites the source. In sum, priests denature reality by promulgating supernatural notions, which are thought to be nihilistic and unhealthy. Not surprisingly, then, Nietzsche thinks that the priest, quote, should be ostracized, starved, driven into every type of desert, end quote, footnote 365 cites the source. I should note that, as was the case regarding his portrayal of the relationship between religion and truth, many will find Nietzsche's depiction of the relationship between religion and health inadequate and unwarranted. To be sure, some will deny his assertion that Christianity engenders misery, and there are, after all, many Christian writers who talk about and emphasize joy. While Nietzsche may be right to suggest that some religious individuals are prone to misery, there are certainly religious individuals, including Christians, who are not, as will become clear in Chapter 3. Moreover, while Nietzsche suggests that religion is unhealthy and detrimental to earthly life, there are clearly some cases of religious individuals who inspired positive effects in this life. Take, for example, the instances of positive social reform initiated by prominent religious thinkers, such as the well-known case of Martin Luther King Jr., who was a Christian minister. Finally, one could argue that in his juxtaposition of Christianity with Buddhism, Nietzsche compares Christianity at its worst with Buddhism at its best. Despite such concerns, Nietzsche clearly believes religion is antithetical to health and to earthly life, constituting a kind of psychological disease. In view of this, he offers a remedy. What most human beings, especially the religious, need, Nietzsche advises, is a, quote, revaluation of all values, end quote. So that, again, was part 4 of Chapter 2, Friedrich Nietzsche and the Antichrist, from The Utility of Religion, Mill, Nietzsche, and James. Thanks.